You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
It is July 17th, 2018. And we have a really excellent program on today. Our program today will be focusing on the deep state, the New World Order, and necessarily then the UN, which is right at the heart of that whole process. World government has been a dream for a very long time, and we have got a lot of folks in the world and in the United States of America who have been promoting that for a very long time, but they've been doing it clandestinely. And now it is starting to be exposed, and it is literally a worldwide conspiracy to control the United States of America and the last bastion of constitutional Republican government left in the world. And so we are in the process of fighting back. We are in the process of trying to expose that. We are in the process of trying to really describe and outline what the deep state really is and how deep this plot runs and how long it runs. Today on my radio show, I have two really exceptional guests. I have John F. McManus. John was the former president of the John Birch Society. He is an accomplished author. He is also a very accomplished public speaker and has spent literally most of his life, if not virtually all of his life, trying to expose the New World Order and what the UN and the ideas of global governance is all about. And I also have on the call today William F. Jasper, and Mr. Jasper is also a very accomplished author, and he is also the senior editor of the New American magazine. And welcome to the show, gentlemen, and thank you for being part of this discussion. I very much have looked forward to this because the timing is excellent, and we are at a point in our country's history where I think if we don't expose what's happening, we have very little chance to fight it. John, welcome to the show, and I'll start off with you. You are kind of the, let's call it the resident expert of the Illuminati, and so maybe I think the best discussion would be to start the radio show with you giving us a walk-through history, describing how this collectivist thinking that is behind the UN and the deep state and global government, where this thinking started and how it has progressed over the last 200 years.
Very good. Nice to be with you. All throughout history, there have been individuals who thought that the world should be run by them. And some of them appealed to the people to elect them. Some of the people allowed them to become the king or the regent or something. But others worked behind the scenes in a conspiratorial manner to grasp power. The times we live in today can be traced back to the intentions of a man named Adam Weishaupt, who started the Illuminati conspiracy in Bavaria in 1776. 1776 was quite a year, by the way. May 1st is when the Illuminati conspiracy began, and of course the 4th of July is when we celebrate our own independence from England. Other things did happen as well, but anyhow, get back to the Illuminati. This was a group that was formed by this single individual. He was a professor at the university in Ingolstadt in Germany. He organized a concentric circle group of individuals all of whom pledged allegiance to him and to his goal, but at varying levels of awareness of what the whole story was really all about. That's why we talk about concentric circles. At the apex of the circle was Weishaupt himself. He took control of continental European masonry at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad in 1782. He had all kinds of individuals joining his takeover of the world. And they brought on the French Revolution, from which France has never recovered, slaying tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Their attack was on thrones and altars, the monarchy in France and in other countries, and also the Catholic Church. They were very opposed to the Catholic Church and its influence among the people in Europe. Weishaupt was succeeded in control of the conspiracy by a man named Mazzini in Italy. Mazzini formed the Carbonari. They laid out their plans to continue destroying the Catholic Church from within and so forth. We move on and we see other attempts, other individuals being involved in promoting the goal of Weishaupt, who had passed away, but it continued. And we see World War I, which never should have involved the United States, but did. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, was very anxious to be a leader of the world government that was being discussed. And so he tried to get the United States at the end of World War I to join the League of Nations, but the U.S. Senate said no. And we never did join the League of Nations. But then there was another war, World War II, when we did, after it, join the United Nations, something new and different. And the League of Nations turned over whatever it had to the United Nations. One of the organizations that was formed at the close of World War I in America was called the Council on Foreign Relations. If you talk about the deep state in America, you have to start pretty much with the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization which was formally put together in 1921, whose goal right from the start, and they admitted it, was world government. And they have produced all kinds of politicians and media leaders and corporate leaders and so forth. The Council on Foreign Relations has been known as the Insiders by the John Birch Society, but the term deep state has pretty much succeeded. And if you go to the deep state, you want to start with the Council on Foreign Relations. Then you get to the Trilateral Commission. You get to the Skull and Bone Society at Yale University. You get to the Bilderberger movement. All of these are part of the deep state. Our magazine, The New American, put out an entire issue on that subject of the deep state, about 2 or 3 months ago. It's still available, and we recommend very much that people get a copy, which you can do by contacting jbs.org. So there's a capsulized introduction to what we talk about as the deep state, and I'll now let Bill Jasper add whatever he wants to what I've said.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, John. And one thing that we need to make our audience aware of is that George Washington and our early leaders were very aware of the attempts by the Illuminati in Europe to make inroads into the United States and to, let's say, weasel their way into the American system of government. And they made statements to that effect clear back, literally, about at the time of our country's founding. And George Washington was quite clear about that. Even though he was a Mason, it is a different form of Masonry than what the Weishaupt and the Illuminati were trying to create in America and in Europe. Am I right about that, John?
Yes, you're right. George Washington was inducted into Masonry. He never spent much time working at it, or he was more or less apart from it. But yes, he was a member at one time in his life, and there were pictures of him helping to set the foundation for the new Capitol building, and he dressed him up in Masonic regalia again. But he had read the book by John Robeson, the British historian scientist, who had studied the entire conspiracy by traveling around Europe. Weishaupt was very clear about his intentions, and John Robeson was very clear about exposing them. And George Washington was given a copy of the book by Robeson, a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. He read the book, and he wrote back to the preacher who had sent it to him and thanked him, saying that there is no doubt that the Illuminati is active and trying to gain control in our own country. So 1798 was the book Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robeson. That's a book that's still available through the John Birch Society. I've recently gone through it again, and it's quite startling to read what it says.
Mm-hmm. Well, and your comment about the fact that the Illuminati were at the heart of the French Revolution, and literally France has been living under a system that was part of that French Revolution, and they've never really shaken the impacts and the effects of that kind of socialist control. Bill, I want you've written several excellent books on the United Nations and the communist underpinnings of that organization, and I want you to please tell our listeners how the UN was conceived and formed from the ashes of the failed League of Nations, as John just mentioned, and how they, the groups that were really behind, or the individuals, let's say, that were really behind the formation of the UN from the U.S. perspective, and how that was heavily influenced by communists from the very beginning.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, Dan, I want to thank you very much for having me on your program. And it's a double pleasure to be on with you and with my colleague, John McManus. Jack McManus and I go back many decades together in our work. He was, until recently, the publisher of the New American magazine, of which I'm the senior editor. And so we've worked on many projects and fought together on many battles. So it's a pleasure being on with Jack. We don't often get to be on the same program together.
Mm-hmm. And, well, that's why I wanted you on, Bill, because Quite frankly, I think you guys are probably two of the very best experts in the world on just exactly what's behind the deep state and the UN.
Well, a number of things that John McManus mentioned are so important. First of all, he went back. You asked him to talk about the Illuminati, and he went back to that. And he just mentioned here just a moment ago the French Revolution, and you did, about how France hasn't recovered from that. Well, we just went through a couple of days ago the anniversary of the French Revolution, July 14, and it is celebrated still in France and all over the world, particularly in communist countries. People do not realize that the French Revolution was the first real communist revolution. The people who formed the French Revolution, the secret societies, the Illuminati there, the Jacobins, and the other anti-Christian forces there, began to really put forward the whole goal of completely upending thrones and altars and all civil society, reordering everything along a communistic model. And that is why all of the leaders of communist revolutions, from Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, all refer reverentially to the French Revolution. And most of them were trained, or a lot of them were trained in at the Sorbonne and other universities in France in the early part of the 20th century, and even up through the 1960s, who spread revolution all over the world. And another important thing that John mentioned here is the importance in understanding the deep state, what we're talking about with the deep state, meaning that organized effort within the conspiracy, within our government, in the various intelligence agencies, and all throughout the federal bureaucracy, particularly in the executive branch, but also including legislative branches, the Senate and the House, and particularly over the last 75 years, the judiciary, where we have seen the penetration and organized spread throughout our governing centers of power, and not only in government, but in the media, in the major corporations and whatnot. We've seen this organized effort to take control of our government and of our society, to break down the checks and balances which are built into our constitutional system, and to concentrate all power centrally, so that individuals no longer have any guaranteed rights or protections of their rights, because the government, which is supposed to be protecting those, has been taken control of and is now being used to wipe out their rights, to destroy their rights. And one of the important things that John mentioned, and which the John Birch Society has been in the forefront of pointing out, is that there have been, in the last couple of years, there have been a profusion of books talking about the deep state, from liberals, from far-left individuals, from conservatives. One of the really important elements that almost all of them leave out, you can look right away in their index, in their chapter heads and whatnot, almost all of them leave out the real brain trust that is in the forefront of moving this operation of the deep state in the United States and around the world, and that is the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. And we don't fixate on that to the exclusion of other operational centers, but clearly for over a century, the Council on Foreign Relations has been the brain trust, the central operating command center here in the United States. It's located at Pratt House in New York City. I've been there to their headquarters. Jack has been II. They are a semi-secret organization. There are actually secret organizations above them, but they are the one that is the front organization for this movement to create world government, to concentrate all economic, financial, political power in the hands of a few. And the Council on Foreign Relations was at the pinnacle of putting together what we now know as the United Nations. John mentioned that it began after World War I, using the specter of war. All of the key people who were pushing for world government used the reaction of people to never wanting to have to go into another terrible war like World War I again. They used that, okay, well, the solution is to have world government, and world government would stop these wars between nations. Trying to evade the obvious conclusion that, well, in order to stop nations from fighting with each other, this world government would have to have virtually unlimited power. It would have to be able to overpower any nation. And if you give that kind of power to any individuals or groups of individuals, how are we to have any kinds of checks and balances on their use of power? Anyway, the League of Nations failed. Out of the League of Nations, there was right after the League of Nations meeting, there was a big, important meeting in France after the Versailles Treaty, and then in London as well, where the Council on Foreign Relations, or the beginning of what would a couple of years later become the Council on Foreign Relations, took place. And the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR for short, then began a program to gather together powerful people in the universities, the media, and in corporate America and banking, to put together the kind of brain trust, put out the publications, have the seminars and meetings which would recruit and educate a coterie of influential people in the United States that would sell the idea of an end to nationhood, an end to national sovereignty, and the need for global government. And they began that in the 1920s. And after World War II, they had the U.S. Senate refused to ratify their plan, which was called the League of Nations. And then after that failed, after World War II, they jump-started it again as the United Nations. And a couple of my books on that are Global Tyranny, Step by Step, the United Nations, and the Emerging New World Order. So that came out in 1992. And then a later one, the United Nations Exposed. And I've been an accredited correspondent for the New American Magazine at the United Nations for over 30 years. I've been going there. I've been to many of their major summits around the world, many of their major summits at the United Nations in New York. And I've been able to see up close and personal, eyewitness, what it's really like at these events and how they run them, how they stage manage these things, bringing in the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, all these radical organizations that are financed by the Soros, Rockefeller, Ford foundations, to give the appearance, they're really rent-a-mobs, and they give the appearance that these are popular programs that the United Nations is putting forward, whether it's for global warming, control of all the world's environment, or whether it's the children's World Children's Program, or the Women's Program, or Indigenous peoples. So they put together all these rent-a-mobs and bring them to the United Nations in New York or to the various UN summits, and then all the television cameras and everyone focus on them and give the impression that this is the voice of the people, the vox populi, and that these are the people who really are expressing the desires of the world's population, that we need to go ahead and approve all of these programs. And so the New American Magazine has been exposing this for over 40 years, and we have, prior to that, we had American Opinion Magazine and the Review of the News Magazine, and I wrote briefly for both of those magazines before they were merged into the New American. And as I said, John McManus was a publisher of that for many years and still a contributor to it.
Mm-hmm. And I need to mention before we get too far away, although we're going to be talking about the CFR, there's a terrific book by James Perloff that is called Shadows of Power that the John Birch Society sells on their website, and boy, it sure gives a really good understanding of exactly what the forces and the people behind the Council on Foreign Relations, just exactly how much control they have of our federal government, and it's a real eye-opener. So I'd certainly suggest to our listeners, go to jbs.org, and you can order that book online, and it is terrific. And they can order your books too online, Bill. And I wanted to get back to the Dumbarton Oaks Conference and Alger Hiss and some of the actors that were part of the original UN framework convention that they had that put together the architecture for the UN. I want you to kind of give our listeners a little bit of background on just how that group, let's say, sprung out of much of the Soviet espionage out of the State Department that existed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Okay, yes. That's very important, very crucial understanding to have with regard to what the United Nations is and how it was formed. Many people, including many conservatives and patriots who don't particularly like the United Nations, who say, it seems like it's a collection of dictators and potentates and not very nice people, and I don't like it. We need to reform it. And our position has been that no, it is not reformable. We need to get out of the United Nations, stop funding it, and get the United Nations out of the United States. So why do we take that position? And why do we consider that it is unreformable and irredeemable? The people who designed it and who have promoted it, the globalists, the deep state people, for the last several decades since it was formed in 1945 after World War II.
Bill, I hate to stop your discussion here. I hear our break coming on, but please keep that thought, and we will pick that up right after our commercial break.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the ring.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today we have on our program John McManus and William Bill Jasper, and we were talking about the formation of the UN and how actually that process was fostered and pushed in the United States just prior to the end of World War II, and how it really sprung from the ashes of the failed League of Nations. Before we get back into the discussion, I want to remind our listeners to continue to support this radio station, continue to buy products from our sponsors, and please tune in for the other programs on this radio station, Life, Liberty, and all that jazz, which follows up my radio show and is from Tuesday through Friday. And then also tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock Pacific time until 10 a.m. Pacific time is the Radioactive Wednesday with Debbie Boscalupi. And Debbie has a terrific radio show that she and I kind of try to coordinate many of our programs together so that we have a certain continuity in what we're doing. And we're here to make America aware of just exactly how far down the rabbit hole we've gone. And Debbie certainly does a terrific job with that. And also, Jeff Bennett does a terrific job with that immediately following our radio shows. So anyway, getting back to the discussion, Bill, you were talking about the Martin Oaks conference.
Dan,
yes.
This is John McManus.
Yes, John.
I want you to go back to Bill, but there's 2 points I want to make that would. I know Bill knows these points, but he didn't bring them up. First point is that when the Council on Foreign Relations started in 1921, they started a magazine called Foreign Affairs. And I think it was the very first issue of Foreign Affairs where they talked about the need for world government. So we're not making this up. The Council on Foreign Relations decided that all by itself. Now, as far as the founding meeting of the United Nations was held in San Francisco in April and May into June of 1945, and there were 32 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the U.S. delegation, a delegation led by Alger Hiss, who was later shown to be a communist. Let me just mention a few names of the people who were in that group that helped to found the United Nations. One, John Foster Dulles, Foy Kohler, John J. McCloy, Cord Meyer, Leo Pazvalsky, Nelson Rockefeller, Harold Stassen, Adlai Stevenson, and so forth. It's really interesting to look at the list of the people who represented our country at the founding of the United Nations. There were 2 senators who said no in 1945, and to read their speeches is to know that they at least had read the charter. Most of the senators didn't take the time to read the charter. They just went along with the idea, we got to do something different, we got to stop there being wars, and so on and so on. So with that said, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Well, great. That was an excellent overview, and I have to mention that with that UN Charter, the difference between the UN Charter and between our Constitution and our Bill of Rights is literally diametrically opposed, because under the UN Charter, every right comes from government, and there's no such thing as natural rights or God's law. It's strictly government control, and it's strictly top-down. Bill, that was all a good segue into what you were talking about, and I'm sorry I had to interrupt you for the commercial break. You know how that is. You got to pay the bills. But anyway, please continue with what you were talking about.
Yes, and what I'd like to do is build on what John McManus just mentioned. And I should point out, by the way, I think you've mentioned his book, and I don't think he has either, but in talking about the deep state and the Council on Foreign Relations, the globalists, etc., John has written a book which has been updated a number of times. He began it, I think, back during the Carter administration, the insiders, and that's a term that we coined back in the 1960s to describe the deep state back then. Those insiders who are in our government that are working with the communists to create a world government, but many of them not obviously members of the Communist Party itself, but working hand in hand with them. And that included in his book, The Insiders, he goes into the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission particularly. But then that gets back to what we were talking about with the formation of the United Nations. And here's the dimension that has really mystified many people, and that is that the primary forces pushing for creating this world government would seem to be diametrically opposed to each other, because on the one hand you have these globalists as represented by the pillars of Wall Street and of the city in London and other centers of banking power. You have the J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Soros, huge billionaire banking empires and financial corporate powers pushing it. That's undeniable. That's right from the very beginning. And we see that the Council on Foreign Relations behind it. Jack just mentioned a number of the stellar names associated with that, from John J. McCloy to John Foster Dulles, etc. But then it's also undeniable that the communist powers throughout the world, which would seem to be opposed to the banking, financial, capitalist powers, also pushing for the same thing, and often working very chummily with each other in these things, which we document in our book, Global Tyranny, Step by Step. So you got one of the main individuals you mentioned. We should go into in a little bit of detail, and that's Alger Hiss, because he represents both sides in there. He was a communist agent, an agent of Stalin. He was also a top member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Alger Hiss was the man who was put in charge of the State Department for, as Assistant State Department Secretary, to put together the charter for the United Nations. And he then also became the acting Secretary General at the founding conference in San Francisco in 1945. In 1995, 50 years later, they had a huge 50th anniversary of the United Nations in San Francisco, which brought together world leaders, prime ministers, presidents. I was there as a representative, as a correspondent for the United Nations for the New American then. But Alger Hiss was the man who was in charge, and he had, just prior to the actual conference, the founding conference, at the Dumbarton Oaks conference there in San Francisco, he had helped draft the Charter of the United Nations, which is referred to with such great reverence in our history books and in our civic studies, and whenever anybody talks about the United Nations, it is held up as this sacred text, on a par with our Constitution, or even above it, almost as Holy Writ. Now, who, besides Alger Hiss, who was a traitor to his country, he was a Soviet spy. His name was well known a generation or two ago. Had a very famous trial where he was convicted, although for decades there was all this defense still being made of him by the left and by the communists, saying that he had been railroaded, he'd been red-baited, he wasn't really a traitor. This was a case of so-called McCarthyism. But no, the record is now very, very solid. Even many of the liberals who were once on his side. Professor Weinstein and many others have gone and said, now the evidence is irrefutable. He was a Soviet agent. He is the man who drew up the Charter of the United Nations for our side, while Vyacheslav Molotov, who is Stalin's foreign minister, his agent, drew it up for the Soviet side. So you had these two Soviet communist agents drew up the Charter of the United Nations, and it is very, very similar then, and it's no surprise that it is similar to the Soviet Constitution and to their whole way of thinking. But it wasn't just Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was in charge of the conference, and he brought in all of the people for the U.S. side who would be representing us. Jack already mentioned, John McManus already mentioned all of the CFR members who were brought in. These were all high-name people who had been served in various administrations and in Wall Street and in corporate America. But Alger Hiss also brought in people who were outright communist agents and were later exposed. Many of them were sent to jail or fled the country. People like Solomon Adler, Virginius Frank Coe, Lawrence Duggan, Noel Field, Victor Perlow, Harry Dexter White, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, and on and on. In my book, Global Tyranny, Step by Step, I have a chapter called Reds, which goes into all of this in quite some detail. Now, so all of these people at the San Francisco conference, we had it loaded with globalist one-worlders from the Council on Foreign Relations. We had it loaded with Americans who were actual communist Soviet agents. So the people I just named played key roles in bringing the United Nations into being. They were our representatives there. So this was definitely conspiracy. And the point we should make here is that, again, is that Alger Hiss was both a communist and a Council on Foreign Relations globalist. And he was protected over and over again by the globalists in our government, going clear back to a decade, more than a decade before the San Francisco Conference and the Dumbarton Oaks Charter gatherings. The FBI had several times gone to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president at that time, with extensive files showing that Alger Hiss, who was moving up through the State Department, was a member of the Soviet apparatus in our government, that he was working for Stalin. He was dismissed, or rather, Roosevelt dismissed all of that, and he continued his upward climb. And so it was no wonder that then 6 years after the founding, 6 years after the founding of the United Nations, Senator James O. Eastland, who was in the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, I believe he was chairman at that time, he said in his hearings on the activities of U.S. citizens employed by the United Nations, he said, and I'll quote, "I am appalled at the extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the UN among the American employees there the greatest concentration of communists that this committee has ever encountered. These people occupy high positions. They have very high salaries, and almost all of these people have in the past been employees in the U.S. government in high and sensitive positions," end quote. So when one understands the origins of the United Nations, and you see the founding conference and who was there putting all the people in places of power, all of the high-level communists that I mentioned before that Alger Hiss put into place, it is not it's not really surprising that a few years after that, the Senate would go, "Oh my gosh, look at how did this happen? We have all of these communists in positions of power, and they're making decisions and pushing agendas that are favorable to communists and socialists worldwide and harmful to the United States." Unfortunately, Senator Eastland and others like him who issued those warnings were largely ignored or were ridiculed and satirized by the media, which was promoting this globalist agenda. The fake news media that finally now, many decades later, we have a president of the United States who has come right out and called them what they are. They're fake news, and they're worse than fake news. They're enemy propaganda, and that's what he said in one of his first tweets and one of his first statements. President Trump did when he said it is the media of the United States, and he named specifically CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, and a few others. He said they are the enemies of the American people. And the globalists tried to turn that around and say that he is against the First Amendment, that he's against all the news media. No, he was very specific that there are enemy agents in our media that have been promoting this agenda to destroy the United States sovereignty and promote world government. And that is why there's been such a violent reaction against him by the media, and
by the people that want to continue that process. John, I want to get you, and pardon me, Bill, but I want to get John back in the discussion because Anthony Sutton wrote a book describing how the Bolshevik Revolution was funded by American and European bankers, and how the whole concept of communism wouldn't really have succeeded had it not been for the funding by these big international bankers, including J.P. Morgan especially, and certainly the Rothschilds and others. John, you've written a lot, and you've done some videos on just how the money, follow the money, and you'll find out exactly who's doing what. And so with that segue, I'd like you to kind of talk about how people like the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Rothschilds and all these groups have been funding this whole process literally since the first days of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Well, not only did the bankers fund what happened in Russia and keep it going, but the U.S. government did as well. We, when I say we, I mean the U.S. government saved communists in the 20s from collapse because of their socialism and so forth. In the 30s, the Roosevelt administration recognized them diplomatically and saved them again. During World War II, we built the Soviet Union's military, and ever since there has been a tremendous amount of flow of money and equipment and trade of all kinds going to communist nations to keep them afloat. Now, there's been a change, obviously, in the domination of other nations by Soviet Union. The Soviet Union imploded, and all of Eastern Europe, they became independent. Most of the communist leaders there changed their label, and they became socialists, but they're still the same kinds of people. Angela Merkel being one of the chief ones in that regard. She was a communist in East Germany, and then she became a socialist, and now the leader of Germany. But the point is that without Western help, communism would never have gotten off the ground and would never have succeeded. It would have gone out of business in the 20s and in the 30s. In the 40s, it would have not survived World War II, but except for the United States again. So the greatest help to keeping communism alive after helping to create it was the government of the United States, aided in many respects by what you point out, the banking industry, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and so forth. So it's a deep conspiracy, and the word, of course, you're not supposed to be allowed to use the word conspiracy. I don't know a better word to describe what's been happening and what has happened throughout the 20th century than conspiracy. It definitely is a conspiracy, and it continues. The conspiracy didn't end when the Soviet Union imploded. The conspiracy just decided, okay, we're going to operate through a different method to get the same goal of world government.
Right. And with the moves and the financing of communism by the U.S. government and by many of the shadow government players who really control this country, the financial system, the Federal Reserve System, which we know is patently unconstitutional, in spite of what some people would say to the contrary, we created a mechanism that turned our exceptional American system, which was based on assets and on hard assets, into a completely debt-driven system of finance for our entire country. And as a result, we are so many trillions of dollars in debt, and literally hundreds of trillions if you look at the unfunded liabilities that we are facing, and they've totally destroyed our ability to fight back with that, haven't they?
Yes, they have. You're absolutely right. Let me mention an interesting connection here. In the 1920s, there was a industrialist in the United States named Fred Koch, K-O-C-H, and he was building refineries and so forth. Well, he was persuaded by the United States government to go to the Soviet Union and to help them build their own system of refineries and exploit the tremendous resources that the Soviets have underground in their country. So he went, and he was so horrified by what he saw after spending time in the Soviet Union that he eventually wrote a little book about it. And then Fred Koch became one of the men who was at the founding meeting of the John Birch Society way back in 1958. His little book, A Businessman Looks at Communism, is an exposure of the horror of the Soviet Union. And Fred Koch, very, very devoted member of the Birch Society. I had the pleasure of meeting him before he passed away, and I think it was in 1966 that he passed away. We've tried to get his two sons involved in the society, and it's always been a failed operation. They want to do whatever they want to do by themselves, and they don't want to have anything to do with the Birch Society.
And that would be the Koch brothers that we hear so much about.
Yes, and that would be, and that of course would be a choice of anybody. You can affiliate with the John Birch Society, or you can go and try to stop what's happening to our country with your own organization, your own money, and so on. That's fine. But we could surely use the help, and these people have the ability to give an awful lot of help financially to what we do. But I got to know Fred Koch, the father, and he was totally determined member of the John Birch Society. It was a delight to meet him, and I feel very fortunate that I did get to know him a little bit.
Well, all I can say with that is that what we're trying to do here now is kind of connect the dots on how this whole system came into being, and then in the next hour I want to move into more specifically the deep state and how these different forces are trying to really push the American sovereignty and our system of government into a, let's say, back us into a corner where we have very few options, and literally take away our national sovereignty. So we're moving into a commercial break, and so let's pick it up on the other side of the break.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today on my radio program I have Mr. John McManus and Mr. William Jasper, and I have to lead into this second hour because we really need to get into the deep state. But I think all of us recognize that we've been drifting into socialism. As Judge Bork said, we're slouching into socialism. And I want people to understand this has been going on for a very long time. I've got a quote here by Norman Thomas, who was a six-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America, and he was one of the founding members of the Communist Party USA. And it is, quote, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened," unquote. And boy, that sure describes all the forces that have been pushing this socialist stuff on the American people, and we are so close to the failure of our nation as a sovereign republic, and that's what we're here today to talk about. And we're going to talk about how we can maybe make some real difference and make that change. So, John, did you have a chance to? Do you want a chance to finish your thoughts about how the whole system has really kind of coalesced into the UN?
Well, the UN is the goal, of course. They've always wanted to have a world government, and the World Government Organization is the United Nations. And I doubt that very many of your listeners, and I know that most of the American people, have never seen the Charter of the United Nations. I always like to point out a single sentence. It's Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations, where it says that member nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Now, that means that if you're a member of the United Nations, you agree that if the United Nations says jump, you say how high. You go ahead and follow what they want done. And our people, any American who has subscribed to that, is perfectly willing to cancel the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. But that's part of the UN Charter, Article 25. So what I say, let us get out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States. That's been the goal for a long, long time. And I certainly know that Bill Jasper agrees with that.
Yeah, I'm sure he does too. And I have to mention the fact that the Security Council is dominated by socialist and communist countries. You look at the makeup of the Security Council, the way it was created in 1945. Taiwan, which was originally representing communist or China, I shouldn't say communist China. Now it is taken over by communist China. We've got Russia, we've got France and Britain. All of those nations are socialist nations, probably Britain being the closest to our form of government, and they're quite highly socialist. So obviously any decisions that come out of the Security Council are going to be pretty biased in the favor of communism or socialism, and now they're talking about creating a Security Council that the UN players pick the people, and they're no longer permanent members, which is even worse if that's even a possibility. Bill,
Dan, let me mention something. You're mentioning the Security Council of the United Nations. There are 5 permanent members, and they all have a veto. One of them, of course, is the United States. We have a veto if the United Nations comes up and says, okay, we want everybody to do this. The United States can veto it and not do it. But we never use the veto in our favor. We never use it.
Right.
The people that we send to the United Nations, the ambassador to the United Nations and so on, they don't get direction from Washington to do that, to separate the United States from some of the terrible things that the United Nations does and continues to do. No, they don't do that at all. So the fact that we have a veto is meaningless if we don't use it.
Right.
But again, go back to Article 25. It says very bluntly, it's only one sentence, it says very bluntly that the members of the United Nations shall accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Now, another thing that has happened is, ever since we got involved in the United Nations in 1945, we have gone to war several times. We're at war even today without a declaration of war as called for by the United States Congress. We didn't declare war in Korea. We didn't declare war in Vietnam. We didn't declare war in Iraq. We didn't declare war in Afghanistan. We have never declared war since right after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And we won that war, and we haven't won a war since. That's a very key point.
It is.
Any listener who hears that ought to say to himself, well, why didn't I think of that? We haven't won a war since the last war where we declared the war and went and fought it and won it. That was World War II. We didn't win in Korea. We didn't win in Vietnam. We didn't win in Iraq. We didn't win in Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan was still there 17 years later after we first went into Afghanistan. And there are people who say, well, the United Nations doesn't run that war. NATO runs it. And they don't know that NATO is a part of the United Nations. So
exactly.
They got us coming 6 ways from Sunday, as the phrase goes. And it's time for the American people to wake up to the reality. And I'll turn it back now over to you and to Bill Jasper.
Well, John, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you're absolutely right. And what we need to understand is that we now are looking for sanction from the UN, where we used to look for our Congress to declare war. And under a Constitution, that's the way it's supposed to be, is Congress is the only one that can make those decisions. And now the President of the United States goes to the UN and looks for their sanction instead of Congress. And that's a key point, too. So, Bill, I'd love to have you come back into the conversation, because I really want to kind of wrap up some of the discussion about the UN, because I want you to point out how key the UN is to the architecture of the deep state, and then I'd like to really start defining what the deep state is.
Very well. What we see, 2 years ago, we did a special presentation in the New American magazine on the United Nations on the verge of becoming a world government. And in that, we illustrated both with the text and then with visuals, with images and whatnot, the fact that most Americans are completely unaware of, but if you travel, particularly in third world countries, as I have, it becomes very glaringly obvious, and that is that you can travel around the United States here. You do not see a UN flag flying very often. You will find it over some schools, and you'll find it over some public buildings, etc. But you don't see UN military vehicles, UN trucks, UN tent cities, all of these things which we see if we go into particularly third world countries. We see their governments in Latin America, in many of the Caribbean islands, in Africa. Their governments have virtually been taken over by the United Nations, both the United Nations itself, UN so-called peacekeeping forces, the UN refugee centers, United Nations and World Bank and International Monetary Fund operations and headquarters, which one can see quite readily. You see men and women in UN uniforms, UN trucks, UN tanks, UN military vehicles. And then when you look at, so we have a map, a global map in that issue of the magazine, and it's online. You can go online and see it. It's interactive. You can pull it up. And it shows from the UN's own maps all of their operations around the globe, military operations, and then there are other various UNESCO and UNICEF programs around the world, World Health Organization. So we show the map there. And then most people are unaware of the fact that all over the world, the United Nations over the last 50, 60 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, has been putting up huge buildings, big palatial buildings for headquarters of its various organizations, such as UNICEF, UNESCO, World Health Organization, etc. So we show all of those various buildings, and I've been to many of them in Rome, in Geneva, in London, in Paris. But then when you get into the third world countries, they've started putting them there also. And so we now have tens of thousands of UN bureaucrats and employees and their subsidiary organizations and NGOs that work with them, basically running many of the countries of the third world and influencing or controlling their votes at the United Nations. So you have all these now 200 nations, over 200 nations at the United Nations that come together there, who supposedly represent global humanity. And the organization that they are using as their meeting place there really controls most of those countries, and so they vote the way the UN tells them to vote. And of course, now the UN is the Secretary General at the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, former Prime Minister of Portugal, former President of the Socialist International. And the New American Magazine is about the only publication in the world that has really exposed what the Socialist International is. Most Americans have never even heard of it. It's one of the most powerful organizations in the world. The Socialist International is a coalition of all these socialist parties, many of which formerly called themselves communist parties, all over the world, and many of them are the ruling parties in their countries. And so you have prime ministers and presidents and various leaders of these of the Socialist International and of their national socialist parties coming together regularly, and they meet every year, sometimes several times a year, at the United Nations. And they are the ones who are the dominant force at the United Nations, both right now as Secretary General and usually as the Secretary of the General Assembly as well. So when I've been at, for instance, I was one of the few reporters who wasn't a greenie globally warmie at the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and we had Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, a former president of Socialist International. She was one of the main people there running the Earth Summit in Rio, along with I did an article on all the other Socialist International functionaries who were running that conference, and they welcomed Fidel Castro and Mikhail Gorbachev, the two communist leaders, with thunderous applause. And so what we see there is at the United Nations a collection, it's a big dictators club of communists and socialists and other autocrats who have nothing in common with us as Americans who believe in free, limited government, free representation. So that is what the globalists and the communists together have been promoting. And it is the deep state, that is that secret combination of these folks who are communists, socialists, and globalists working together at all levels of our government and other institutions of power in the media and corporate and financial America, who have been pushing this. And if I could for just a minute, I'd drop back to something you mentioned, and then we moved on to something else. And you mentioned Professor Anthony Sutton, Stanford University, who wrote a number of very important books showing the deep state in operation, although he didn't call it that and wasn't quite sure of why this was happening. But he was an economist, and he wrote a number of very important books, particularly on one trilogy of his books, very large tomes, very extensively documented, was Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 3 volumes. And in it, he exposed, using the U.S. Government's own records, showing all the vast transfers of technology, primarily technology, but also money and other goods from the United States to the Soviet Union over decades, showing right from the very start. And one of the things that he found in the U.S. archives was one of the big clues showing the start of the deep state in operation, and that was a cable from Colonel Edward Mandel House, who was the key advisor, the other self, the alter ego of President Woodrow Wilson. And he was over in Europe in 1917, helping get ready for the League of Nations and the forming of the Council on Foreign Relations. And on November 28, 1917, he sent a cable, which became known as the Special Green Cipher, to Woodrow Wilson and to the Secretary of State. And he said, and I quote, "There has been cabled over and published here," meaning in Paris, "statements made by American papers to the effect that Russia should be treated as an enemy." And then he goes on to say, "It is exceedingly important that such criticisms should be suppressed." So here's an advisor who was a Marxist. He wrote his book, Colonel Edward Mandel House. He's at the pinnacle of power. He's the alter ego of the President of the United States. He's helping to form the globalists there. 2 weeks after 3 weeks after the Bolsheviks have taken power in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And he's writing to the President of the United States saying, no, we have to suppress those people here in the United States and those newspapers who are warning the American people that this Bolshevik revolution, this communist revolution, is a danger to the United States. And so the suppression of this kind of information, of this danger, continued from then. And so he then helped form the Council on Foreign Relations to help make sure that this suppression continued, and that only a certain line of thought would be allowed and deemed acceptable in U.S. higher circles. And this then filtered down. So we saw after that they suppressed this information, first of all, by making it secret, so that this continuous stream of information, which Professor Anthony Sutton revealed in his books, one of which he condensed all three of those volumes, and he presented it to the Republican National Convention in Miami in 1972, was the book National Suicide, which he then shows that all of the major Soviet weapons systems, from their submarines to their warships to their transports to their airplanes, their jets, all of that, he shows in detail how all of that technology was transferred to them from the United States. And he used those suppressed documents, those suppressed records from the State Department and the Commerce Department, which gave details about all the engines that were being sent, the hull designs, the armament fixtures and fasteners, all of those things which the Soviets under Lenin and Stalin had no way of accomplishing without our massive help. And so we see massive betrayal and treason for decade after decade after decade, and it was all suppressed during this time so that the American people would not find out about it, and even our elected representatives. He gives an example, for instance, of an inquiry by Senator Smoot, who we know his name primarily from the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but Senator Smoot said, why is it, this was a couple of decades later, he was inquiring as to why aluminum powder was being sent to Russia from the United States. And he said, this is a war material. Why are we giving this to them? So he never got a reply. And Professor Sutton found in the documents there, in the State Department documents, so he was digging around in there, and he found this, this is, quote, directly from the State Department, quote, no reply was made to Senator Smoot by the department, as the secretary did not desire to indicate that the department had no objection to rendering by Mr. Hahn of technical assistance to the Soviet authorities in production of aluminum powder, in view of the possibility that its use as a war material, and preferred to take no position at the time with regard to the matter. In other words, he's saying, end quote. So he's saying, well, we didn't want to take a position on this. We didn't want to stir up public concern over it, so we just didn't reply to Senator Smoot, and the American people were kept in ignorance of it. So we, in the John Birch Society and the New American Magazine, and in our earlier publications, we were exposing these things back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, while the rest of the American media were completely ignoring it, or even when we did force it out into the public view through Congressman Larry McDonald or Congressman John Schmitz or others who were exposing it, it was ridiculed and then quickly swept aside.
Right, and that's the way they've always done it. They ridicule, they kill the messenger, and instead of trying to deal with the message. And your comments about Anthony Sutton and exposés of all the military and different technologies that went to the Soviet Union, a lot of our listeners probably don't realize, but it was a Ford Motor Company truck plant in Russia that was producing many of the trucks that were being used to haul troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam against our own military forces. So this stuff has been going on for a very long time, and it really is at the heart of what the deep state is, because they really don't like our system of government. And John, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about non-governmental organizations and foundation money that has been at the center of so much of this effort to promote the deep state and globalism and radical environmentalism and so many of these things that are literally tearing our Constitution to shreds. And I have to mention before we get into that non-governmental organizations as such did not exist prior to the 1950s, and they're really a product of the United Nations, and they were formed and recognized by the UN as recognized non-governmental organizations, and their purpose under the UN was to foment or shape social change within political bodies throughout the world. And so anyway, John, let me, I didn't mean to go on about that, but I want you to really talk about that, the NGOs and the foundations, and how all that money and all that power is being focused on creating a deep state that destroys our Constitution.
Well, get into the non-governmental organizations first, the NGOs. The United Nations has a system where an organization can go to the United Nations and ask to have recognition by the UN as a non-governmental organization. And there are a lot of people who think that they can undermine the United Nations by becoming an NGO within the United Nations and so forth. But part of the deal is that when you agree to become a non-governmental organization, you have to say and you have to obey a requirement that says you will not in any way undermine the United Nations itself. So this is a way of gathering potential enemies under your wing by the United Nations and silencing them so that they don't speak out. That's non-governmental organizations. There are hundreds of them. They're all over the world, and they continue to attract people into the spider web of the United Nations. And it's a shame that a lot of people have never been apprised of what that really is all about. Now, you wanted me to talk a little bit about foundations and the financing of communism and socialism. Let me start off with a concept that I like to spread, and it's not something you asked for, but the concept that I want to spread is that socialism is more deadly than communism. Now, if I say that, a lot of people say, well, we always used to feel that if a communist nation stopped being communist and became just socialist, that was a plus. I said, really, it's really no different. But the socialist way of taking control of a nation is more dangerous. Okay, now why? Why is it more dangerous than communism itself? Well, first of all, let's talk about communism. Communism seizes control. And any resistance within the country is taken care of by the secret police, by the military, by something like that. In other words, the seizing of control doesn't destroy resistance. Okay, so that's the
John, I hate to stop you. I hear the commercial break coming. Please hold that thought, and we'll pick it up on the other side of the break.
Very good.
Thank you so much for listening to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Dan will be back shortly. In the meantime, Dan wanted me to speak to you about connecting your own dots when it comes to being prepared for any situation. As we have all observed in the news, natural disasters are occurring at a record pace across the United States and the world. Hurricanes and floods, earthquakes, and wildfires burning out of control. You could potentially have a bullseye on your own town or country. For that reason, Dan has partnered partnered with Patriot Prepared to bring you a full line of products to provide the insurance that you need for any unexpected disaster. Whether it's our full line of high-quality, freeze-dried, storable food, our own industry-leading water filtration products, you can find it all by visiting patriotprepared.com/dots. It makes good sense to be prepared. That's patriotprepared.com/dots.
Now you can feel that squeaky clean sensation like none other with Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash is a unique natural formula not found in any other oral care products. With a gentle combination of zinc, folic acid, myrrh, and clove oil, Vitamer effectively whitens teeth, removes plaque, and freshens breath, and it does it naturally without any harmful chemicals. Visit us online at Vitamer.com. That's VITAMYR.com. Or call us today to place your order at 1-888-558-8482. That's 1-888-558-8482. Keep your teeth and gums healthy with Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer, nature's answer to healthy teeth and gums. And remember, it's all completely natural. Available at participating health food stores nationwide.
Olive's Auto Parts, 1135 Michigan Avenue in Orofino. Olive's Guns and Ammunitions, gunsmithing, accessories, scopes by Night Force, new and used. Olive's Chainsaws, sales and service. That's Olive's Auto Parts at 800-592-6832. That once again, 800-592-6832.
Woo, nice shooting. Hey, that's a sweet AK-47 chest rig. Is that multicam?
Yep, got it from StrikeHardGear.com.
Strike what?
StrikeHardGear.com.
Set your sights on StrikeHardGear.com. Tough, tactical gear for your Soviet-style weapon that's made in the USA. Affordable, plus a no-questions-asked 30-day money-back guarantee and lifetime replacement warranty. StrikeHardGear.com. Go ahead, pull the trigger.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You don't really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. And try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now, I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests are Mr. John McManus and Mr. Bill Jasper, and we are talking about the deep state, and we're talking about what the deep state represents, which is world government, and why we need to stand up and fight this with all our power. Before I get back into the discussion, I wanted to mention that Radioactive Wednesday, Debbie Boscalupi's radio show, is on tomorrow morning from 8 a.m. till 10 a.m. Pacific time. And Jeff Bennett's Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz is on immediately after my show today and after Debbie's show. And I also want to mention that it's so important to our listeners. Please support our sponsors, our radio network, and put some effort into this radio network, because we are delivering a message that's not heard anywhere else. And we are the antithesis of the fake news. We are talking about truth and honesty and what is really happening in the world, and you won't get that through very many other radio networks. So please support our network and do what you can to make sure that we spread the word all over the world, not just all over North America, not just all over the Rocky Mountain region. We want to spread this message all over the world because it's so important that people listen. Okay, Jack, I wanted to get back into the discussion that you were leading into, and that is, and you're absolutely right, socialism's more dangerous than communism because socialism is a lot more insidious, and they get away with a lot more, where if you hear the word communism, you tend to immediately react and try to stop that. Under socialism, a lot of these programs have been promoted, and they get really inserted into our political process with very little resistance. So anyway, get back into that discussion if you would, please.
Okay, communism takes control of a country and has to maintain its control with the KGB or the secret police or whatever they want to call it, and so forth. In other words, they haven't destroyed the resistance. The people are still opposed to what's going on. A socialist will gain control of a country by getting the people to vote themselves into the situation through propaganda, through promises that are never kept, and so on. So they destroy resistance in the process of creating a socialist state. Socialism and communism are the same goal. One of them seizes control and has resistance. The other gets you to vote yourself into the condition and destroys resistance. That's why I say that socialism is more dangerous than communism. And nobody should ever forget that the old USSR was not the union of Soviet communist states. It was the union of Soviet socialist states. In other words, the communists themselves told you what their goal was. Their goal was socialism, but they wanted to seize control, and they wanted to force it on people. What's happening throughout the world, and especially in our country, just go back and think about all the people that voted for Bernie Sanders for president. An admitted socialist, a guy who wants to do exactly what we've been talking about here to the United States of America, and that is to destroy resistance to a takeover of the government and an enslavement of the people. Bernie Sanders is a dangerous individual, no doubt about it. Committed socialist, yes, no doubt about it, but dangerous nevertheless. So try to remember, communism is dangerous and bad, but socialism is even worse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you know, the definition of socialism, or the definition of communism, is socialism in a hurry. And I've also heard the comment made, and I think it's absolutely true. Socialists love humanity; they just hate humans, and that's at the bottom of this whole thing. So,
well, you got to remember too that Karl Marx was the author of the Communist Manifesto, and he and Engels, at the start, wanted to call their manifesto the Socialist Manifesto, but they said that there were some screwballs running around Europe calling themselves that, so they decided to call it the Communist Manifesto instead. But the communists and socialists have always fought with each other over who owns the Communist Manifesto. They both subscribe to the very same program. And one of the parts that they subscribe to is creating these foundations that you mentioned to help finance all of the stuff that's going on. And that's a problem in itself. But maybe Bill wants to talk about that.
Well, we definitely need to get into the funding of this thing, and I'm just going to turn it over, let you gentlemen just, speak up and go ahead and enter that conversation. But the money is where all the power resides, and that's why it's so important that we understand the relationship between the deep state, NGOs, tax-exempt foundations, and how we literally have lost our representative government to this kind of deep state thinking. Go ahead, gentlemen. Whoever wants to carry that one, pick it up.
Let me start off by recommending a book called Tax-Exempt Foundations, written by a good friend of both Bill and myself, named Bill McElhenney. Unfortunately, Bill just passed away recently. But anyhow, he wrote a book about the foundation, and it's really a very excellent book. It shows how they work. The foundation system really got its boost when the Wilson administration took our nation into the Federal Reserve System. The foundations were set up, they could be tax exempt, and they could use the funding that they have, which it turns out to be immense funding, to finance socialist and communist organizations and so forth. One of the great tragedies is that old man Henry Ford, who certainly had a fortune, he set up a foundation and he wanted to turn it over to Charles Lindbergh to run. But Charles Lindbergh declined, and so the Ford Foundation fell into the hands of nasty socialists and communists and so on. Ford Foundation's been one of the great financiers of left-wing promotion, along with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment and so forth. These things are bad. They've hurt very, very seriously, and they should be exposed. But Bill McElhenney did a good job of that in the book that he wrote some years ago, and I recommend it to anybody. Bill, what do you want to add?
Well, yeah, you laid the foundation for it there, Jack. What happened was two very extraordinarily consequential acts in the same year in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson. Right in that same time period, the groundwork had been laid for a long time by Wilson's Marxist advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, and the big dynastic fortunes of that era. They put in place, right out of the Communist Manifesto, if you look in the Communist Manifesto, which we were just talking about, two of the main planks, which is a central bank to control the issuance of all currency and credit with the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was created as a result of a conspiracy, the Jekyll Island conspiracy. That's been fully documented. And if you go to Jekyll Island today, you have Treasury Department people there who will acknowledge that, yes, this was the secret meeting of the big Wall Street banking conspiracy, which resulted in the creation of the Federal Reserve. So here you have the capitalist leaders putting into effect part of the Communist Manifesto. And then secondly, the follow-up to that, the graduated income tax, which then made everyone slaves to the central government. I mean, we accept that now. It's gone on for 8 or 9 generations now. We accept that the income tax is just part of our makeup as a country, but it wasn't. And at the time, it was a very revolutionary act, and that's part of the boiling frog analogy of socialism. People get used to it, become inured to it, and now it's thought of as, well, it's always been that way. But the creation of the graduated income tax was sold as a way to force the rich people to pay more money for taxes. So it was using envy and class hatred, class warfare to promote that. And actually, it was some of the richest people in the world who were behind it, who were financing. Why would they do that? Because they already had set up big foundations that they put all their money in. Most American families don't have foundations to protect themselves from the ravages of the income tax. And so it was a way to get the middle class to finance its own destruction. And we've now reached that point where after several generations of taxing the American middle class and using that money then to transfer it to government to create more programs that cost more and more, ever more money, we basically are wiping out the American middle class, the bourgeois. And what is it? The bourgeois, the middle class, are the enemies that the Communist Manifesto, that Marx, Engels, and all communists are always attacking. They're attacking the middle class. Well, the middle class is that's what poor people want to get to, where they can have a decent standard of living. And so we see those twin things, the graduated income tax and the Federal Reserve, bringing that about. And Jack mentioned Bill McElhaney's book, Tax-Exempt Foundations. We've written a number of stories in the New American covering this very important topic and how it affects us today in financing our own destruction. A recent one that I did in January of 2017, which is available online, it's called Foundations, Cutting Off the Toxic Funding Flow. And what that article does is show that by the 1950s, early 1950s, right after World War II, American people were becoming very alarmed that the communist onslaught all over the world and the communist socialist movement here in the United States seemed to be invariably funded by the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Foundation, later on the MacArthur Foundation, and now there are literally hundreds of these foundations by millionaires, billionaires who've been made wealthy by the Federal Reserve System and the funny money schemes we have now that are funding this. But in the 1950s, this became a very big issue, particularly after the communists took over China in 1949. And so then it became very clear that our State Department had helped, our deep state operatives in the U.S. State Department had helped Mao Zedong and had hamstrung Chiang Kai-shek, our ally, the anti-communist leader in China. And so people were quite furious over this, congressmen and patriotic groups, the VFW, the American Legion, etc. And so the big question then was, who lost China? Who was responsible for our State Department making all the quote-unquote wrong decisions? People thought, gee, they were really stupid. They were misguided. No, they were evil. They were betraying us and betraying the people of China. And the investigation led to an organization known as the Institute of Pacific Relations, which published a journal called Amerasia. And in that organization, there were hundreds of professors and former and current State Department officials and other U.S. government officials that were constantly pushing the communist line. And in fact, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee later said, quote, the IPR, Institute of Pacific Relations, has been considered by the American Communist Party and by Soviet officials as an instrument of communist policy, propaganda, and military intelligence, end quote. Went on to show why this was the case. And how this comes around to what we're talking about here is it turns out that the IPR, like so many other organizations promoting this communist line, the Soviet line, were completely funded by these tax-exempt foundations. And so a big effort was made in the U.S. Congress to investigate these. And we first had the Cox Committee, headed by Representative Eugene Cox, got going with a investigation of the tax-exempt foundations. And that committee was Deep Six by the Deep State, and then that was succeeded by the Reese Committee. And the Reese Committee got closer to digging out the truth about the tax-exempt foundations, about the Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie foundations particularly. And that's where, during that investigation, we had the H. Rowan Gaither, the president of the Ford Foundation, make his infamous statement to the chief investigator, Norman Dodd, of the House Committee, of the Reese Committee there, who said, yes, well, our policy here at the Ford Foundation and in these higher circles is to use our grant-making powers to so alter life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And, you know, this was like one of those admissions that you see in a James Bond flick where Goldfinger, just feeling so full of himself and the fact that they're his plans are coming to fruition, that he just has to tell his adversary, who he thinks he's about to dispatch, about all of his brilliance and how he's going to take over the world. And but in this case, Norman Dodd, the investigator, was so flabbergasted by this. He says, "Well, why don't you tell this to the American people?" And Rowan Gaither, the head of the Ford Foundation, says, "This we would not think of doing." And of course, that has been the case ever since. The Reese Committee, I go into in detail on there how it was sabotaged and shut down. They did publish over 2,000 pages of documentation of reports, but then all of the media turned against it and dismissed it and went on to other things. And we really haven't had an investigation since then. So this is 70 years ago almost that this took place, getting close to it. And during that time, these foundations, these tax-exempt foundations who pile up enormous cash piles, which they use then for subversive purposes, such as George Soros is very infamous for doing that. He's the best known now of the current crop of tax-exempt subversive funders, but only because he's really out front. He enjoys the publicity. He really seeks that public approval. Most of the other foundations stay in the background and are just as destructive, and some of them even fund more subversion than he does, but they don't go into the limelight like he does. And so until we cut off that funding flow, and in tandem with it, the whole purpose of getting these tax-exempt foundations going was to fund all of these different subversive organizations, socialist, environmentalist, feminist, LBGT, homosexual perversion networks, etc. Get them funded and get them started as seed money, and then to get them onto the public dole. So the whole thing all along for the last 100 years has been to create a vast network of these termites, these various different organizations that will be working continuously to undermine the United States in all areas, economic, domestics, civil, social, etc. And then to get them on the government dole. And that's what they've been very successful to doing. It's there to make the taxpayer directly, the American taxpayer, fund our own destruction by getting various of our government agencies to take up the funding from the foundations. So in many cases, they are both still the tax-exempt foundations and the government agencies funding all of this destruction of America. But the tax-exempt foundations consider themselves most successful when they can actually transfer the whole burden to the taxpayer, and then they can go and fund some more startup groups. And so that's what we're seeing with the immigration thing, with the Antifa, with all of the resistance groups that are creating havoc in our streets, and that we see every time there's a public demonstration. Almost all of those are totally synthetic, rent-a-mob, astroturf organizations that would not exist if it were not for this continuous stream of funding.
Right. And Bill, I want to mention to our listeners, this is so important, and you certainly pointed it out, but it boils down to one simple thing. The tax-exempt foundations are using all of their money to buy our government and to buy control, and the taxpayers are footing the bill through the income tax. And the system was always designed to be that way so that they could literally suck the middle class dry and do it in a way that they could control everything from the very beginning. John, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about President Trump in the New World Order and the mess that is being attached to destroying American sovereignty. What do you think his chances of success in stopping the New World Order, and how can we help?
Well, I don't. I still have to wonder how far President Trump intends to go. He certainly has done some things that I applaud, but he's also done some things that I shake my head and say, no, you shouldn't do that, Donald. But anyhow, I don't know. What I do know mostly is that the alternative to Donald Trump would have been Hillary Clinton, and that would have been a 100% disaster. So we take the good that Donald Trump has done and may continue to do, and we swallow hard when we see some things that he's done that we don't care for. Right. But you wanted to talk about the deep state. We haven't talked at all about the Trilateral Commission. That's part of the deep state, and that's increasingly important. They just moved their headquarters from New York down to Washington, D.C. They've expanded. It was supposed to be just Europe and North America and Japan, and now it's worldwide. And it was founded by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And one of the first members that they had was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter wasn't even a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he was a member of the Trilateral Commission. And the Trilateral Commission has the same goal as the Council on Foreign Relations. Then you can get into the Bilderberg movement. In 1954, David Rockefeller and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands decided to have an annual meeting of the movers and shakers of the world. And the first meeting they had was in Holland at a hotel called the Bilderberg Hotel. And that's how the annual meeting became known as the Bilderberg movement.
Right. I hate to say this, John. I hear the music. We're going to have to move to the next program, but I want to ask you, gentlemen, would you please come back, because we just barely scratched the surface, and this is such an enormously important discussion. Will you gentlemen consider coming back in the very near future so we can finish this discussion of the deep state?
Okay, this is John. Yes, I'll be available. You tell me when.
Okay, we'll make sure we do that. With that, gentlemen, thank you, and I thank our listeners for tuning in, and continue to connect the dots.